Hello, my name is John Maddog Hall, and I am the board chair for the Linux Professional Institute, the senior technical advisor to Caninos Lucas, the president of Project Kawa, and the president of Linux International. My talk today is what a long, strange trip it's been, and probably will be, talking about the first 30 years of the GNU Linux operating system. I would like to dedicate this talk to Alan Turing, the mathematician, cryptologist, who's considered to be the father of computer science and of artificial intelligence. He was also a war hero, and he helped to reduce World War II by 2 years through breaking the German Enigma code and saved an estimated 14 million lives. In 1969 was my beginning with computers. That was the year of Woodstock, and no, I did not go there. Stonewall Inn, and I didn't do that either. And Humans on the Moon, I certainly didn't do that. But it was also the beginning of what we now call the Internet through a project called the Arpanet and the Unix operating system in Murray Hill, New Jersey, started by two people, Ken and Dennis, who just wanted to start this little operating system for fun, a research project. In the same year, I wrote my first program on an IBM 1130 using punch cards, and I shaved for the last time. But for our presentation today, probably the most important thing that happened in 1969 was in Helsinki, Finland, Linus Torvalds was born. Now, in that beginning time, there was really no such thing as computer science. We were kind of stumbling in the dark. We didn't have any real networking, except maybe carrying a box of cards down the hallway to your friend. There was no security other than locking the door at night when you went home. And yes, you did turn off the computer. There were no graphics per se. There was ASCII art and various crude graphics, and there weren't even systems administrators. We typically had what we called operators, people who would launch the applications and rip paper off the printers and things like that. So we were kind of stumbling in the dark, not computer science, but computer black magic. And of course, Tux, our favorite penguin, didn't exist back then. I'm just using this as an example to show ASCII art from a line printer. Back in those days, there were very large companies selling systems. They sold the hardware, the software, and the support. The systems cost millions of dollars for things that would take up a room in size and have less memory in them than your watch that you're wearing on your wrist today. We had original equipment manufacturers like IBM and Digital Equipment Corporation who sold through distributors and retailers. And most of the software in those days was distributed in source code form, because if the computer had an operating system, it typically was different from system to system. And the other thing was that there were different architectures, and there weren't that many computers of any architecture that was sold. And so in those days, your intellectual property was protected by contract law, and people would get together for weeks or even months to hammer out a contract to buy one copy of one compiler that might go in one system and be used by one person. Unix was a major change to that. The operating systems of those days typically were tied to an application stack. They were designed to do real time, or they were designed to do time sharing, or they were designed to do soft real time, or they were designed for educational purposes. And because of this reason, for example, there were 11 different operating systems for the PDP-11. Manufacturers did this to tune their systems for the applications because computers of those days had such small memories and were relatively slow by today's standards. And so you wanted to get the most efficiency possible out of the operating system on the hardware that it was running. And you also wanted to tune it to an application stack so that the most of the memory that was available could be used by the application itself. And as an example of that, Wang Corporation made word processors, and they were very good word processors. But the only thing they did was word processing. And people quickly found out that it would be nice to have a computer system, if you were spending all of this money, that could do multiple things at different times. So Unix was one of the first operating systems that wasn't tied to a particular hardware architecture. It was designed to be relatively lightweight, and portable across multiple operating systems or multiple hardware architectures. And the trade-off was the efficiency of the operating system versus the efficiency of not having to make massive changes in your application to port it from one piece of hardware to another, and not have to make massive investments in training of your people that you trained on this operating system versus the next one versus the next one. That created a lot of waste in training. Now, about that time, in the period of 1969 to 1983, software was not copyrightable. Copyright could not be applied to software. It couldn't be applied to the binaries in your ROMs, for example. It couldn't be applied to the source code. And therefore, the operating systems were relatively expensive. And if you were getting the source code, you paid for a source code license and the intellectual property that was around that. In the early 1980s, this began to change. Copyright was first applied to ROMs, the ones and zeros inside of a game board, and so that a game manufacturer could manufacture their board and not have other people simply copy it and sell it for less money than they could sell it for. Eventually, also patents were applied to software. And this brought in the ability to distribute binary code that was protected by an end user license agreement, which we know of today as the EULA. In the periods of 1983 to 1984, Unix vendors who had been distributing Unix under a source code contract, which required a source code license from AT&T, a very expensive source code license, started to distribute Unix in binary-only form at a much lower cost and with much more flexibility with what you could do with the system and putting it on different machines. It was less expensive, but you didn't have access to the source code of the system like you had before. Now, there was one person who objected to all this because he was used to getting the Unix operating system in source code. He liked getting the operating system in source code. He liked studying how it worked. He liked writing device drivers for it. And that person was Mr. Richard Stallman, who was at that time a student at MIT. He decided that he was going to rewrite the entire Unix system and have it available in source code form. And so he started a project called the GNU project, which stands for GNU is not Unix, to have that goal. A full operating system with the source code available. And he started, instead of starting with a kernel, because that wouldn't have made much sense. If he had the kernel, he wouldn't have any applications to run on it. But what he did was he started writing portable applications that ran on different operating systems. And so he began bringing people into this GNU project by saying, hey, if you help me build this text editor, Emacs, you'll be able to use that same text editor on all these different operating systems. You'll be able to remember the commands to text editor one time and use it on all these different operating systems. Later on, he did the same thing with libraries and compilers and development tools. And more people began to get the idea of what he was talking about. Portable applications available in source code form so you can easily move them from place to place. Eventually, in 1985, he formed a foundation, the Free Software Foundation, to help to fund and legalize this particular process. Parallel to this was a distribution called the Berkeley Software Distribution, which most people call BSD. It started with Ken Thompson, one of the two people who started Unix, going on sabbatical and teaching at the University of California, Berkeley in 1975. He took along his favorite operating system, which was version 6 Unix by that time, and on a magnetic tape, and the students and the professors and everybody started working at making that better and better. This eventually became part of the Berkeley software distribution. And even though you still needed an AT&T source code license to use it, there was a lot of significant improvements that the University of California, Berkeley made to the system. And not all of those improvements were reincorporated back into AT&T Unix. So Berkeley Unix, or BSD, started being better and better and better and having significant functionality over top of what was in AT&T Unix. Eventually, there was a suit started by AT&T, or actually USL, an offshoot of AT&T Unix, that against a little company called BSDI that was taking the BSD software and trying to distribute the sources and the binaries without having a license from AT&T. And when USL started suing BSD for this, then people started rewriting the AT&T code or the BSD code and taking it out of BSD, trying to make BSD completely free of AT&T code. By 1991, this lawsuit and everything was still going on, but Linus decided he wanted to start a project of his own to write a Unix-compatible kernel for the GNU project. And he was going to do it just for fun. This was not going to be a big commercial thing. It was not going to be as big as Minix, which was another project that was going on at the time. He just got a group of people together to try and do this. Originally, he was going to call it Freaks, but a friend of his convinced him that that wasn't a good idea, so they renamed it to Linux. Also, the GPL licensing was kind of an afterthought. He wasn't really thinking about, what version of the license should I use, or what are the ramifications? He just said, somebody said to him, this is a good thing, let's license it with a GPL, and he did. But the goal at that time was not to create a free of cost operating system or kernel. The goal was to create a good kernel, one that would run on hardware well. And also the goal at that time was to come out with version 1.0, a version of a kernel that was useful to people so that people could go ahead and wrap other code around it to create a distribution. And so in late 1993, by that time, they got up to kernel 0.9999999, kind of approaching version 1.0. And distributions started to be announced, taking the GNU software, things from MIT, things from BSD, all these different pieces of software, putting it together and creating distributions like Soft Landing Systems, Yggdrasil, SUSE, Red Hat, Debian, Slapware, and others. And so by the time that 1994 came around and version 1.0 of the kernel, people were able to move the version 1.0 kernel into their distributions, but that 1.0 kernel only really supported Intel and AMD architecture. Now, there were other ports that people were working on outside of Linus. They would take a snapshot of Linus's kernel code, and they would try and port it to a Spark computer from Sun, or try a Motorola computer. But Linus himself was concentrating on the Intel AMD architecture. About this time was where I started to get into free software. I've been using open source, or the equivalent of open source, for a number of years. I've been lucky enough to always be able to get the source code for the operating system or the source code for the applications I was using for various reasons. But one day, the Unix Special Interest Group of DKIS, Kurt Riesler, started sending email messages out to all these different companies saying, could you give me some money to bring a speaker to DKIS in New Orleans in 1994? And these little companies would write back to him and say, we're a very small company. We don't have much money, but we could give you some CDs to hand out to your people. And nobody in the deck management had ever heard of this person that Kurt was talking about, nor had they even heard of the project that Kurt was talking about. So I went to my management and I said, I don't know who this person is really, and I don't know really what he did, but Kurt usually has good ideas, so I think we should fund this. And so I arranged for this person to fly from Europe to New Orleans to attend a DKIS because I liked and trusted Kurt. After the person was on their way, Kurt turned to me and said he needed an Intel PC to run this code. And this really affected me because I was responsible for selling VAX systems and MIPS workstations and Alpha systems, not this weak, miserable, crappy Intel PC stuff. So I eventually gave in, got Kurt a PC to run the code on. I flew down to DKIS and found Kurt trying to install code on this weak, miserable, crappy Intel PC. He was struggling and couldn't get it to work when finally this nice young man with sandy brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing wool socks and sandals comes along and says in a lilting European accent, "May I help you?" And Kurt looks at him and kind of smiles and says, "Yes, I think you can." And of course, that was Linus Torvalds. And about 10 minutes later, Linux was working on this system. So I tried to code and I really liked it. I thought it was really good and I was impressed. And I took Linus, that's him on the right-hand side in that picture and me on the left, out on Natchez and convinced him to port Linux to the Alpha processor. The Alpha processor from DEC was a RISC computer system, a reduced instruction set computer system. And at the time, it was the world's fastest microprocessor and remained that way for 8 years. It was also a 64-bit system versus a 32-bit system. And so you didn't have just 4 gigabytes of memory space. You had 4 gigabytes times 4 gigabytes of address space. And so Linus started a project to not to port to just 2 architectures, Intel and Alpha, but N architectures, as many different architectures as the Linux community would want to have. People ask the question, why Linux instead of BSD? And BSD has some good points to it, but Linux kind of had a running start over the BSDs because Linus started his project in 1991 at the same time that the BSD issues were still going on in the courts. And they were still trying to go on the courts in 1994 when these distributions started to come out. GNU Linux had some cute symbols to it. Tux and the GNU versus BSD had a demon and devil. Believe it or not, marketing is everything. And there's some people that didn't like BSD because they had a demon to it. But today, the game has changed in creating operating systems. Computers don't cost millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can buy a Raspberry Pi for $35 in most places. You can actually do development through web-based tools. You can collaborate on the software to make it better. You can do marketing of your product or your project through social marketing. You don't need to have a very expensive marketing team. The financing you can get through crowdsourcing, and free software gives you the ability to create a prototype of your idea and show it to the people to do the crowdsourcing so they get enough idea that you're going to have this thing in maybe a year or maybe 6 months instead of 3 years or 4 years or perhaps never. So what about the future? People say, what's the future like, Maddog? I'm not a good predictor of the future. I really am not, because if I was, I would have a jetpack and be able to hop around the city with my jetpack like we all were promised back in the 1960s. And I don't even know what the next operating system will be because things can happen all the time. But I can predict that the next operating system will have a high degree of GNU Linux compatibility, Unix compatibility. Because the thing is that most people are tired of porting their applications from one operating system to the other without having any type of visible improvement in the operating system design. Things that I look to in the future, if you're interested in that, I don't like the term artificial intelligence. I'd like the term inorganic intelligence, being able to duplicate the human mind with its neurons and synapses, utilizing transistors and networking. And I look towards that. I also look towards quantum computing. That's a little bit scary to me, but I think they're going to come. One other thing, if you're looking for something to study, the use of RISC-V as a new architecture and FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays, as accelerators and open source controllers for different systems. So in summary, the path forward for us is that closed source is the enemy. Our enemy is not BSD. It's not the different distributions. It's not the different desktops. We shouldn't be fighting them. We should be embracing them. You need to keep scratching the itch. Look for things that you have a passion about and look to have solution with free and open source software. Building your team is at least as important as building the code itself. You should become a mentor to a newbie. If you have experience and stuff, help the next person coming along, because all the master plumbers out there have apprentices. And I, for one, am getting older and older, and I want to see new people coming in to pick up the banner and move forward. One last plug for a poem that I learned at a very early age. Desiderata is a poem that came out through a person by the name of Max Ehrman in 1948. Go placidly amidst the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. Down at the bottom, with all of its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it's still a beautiful world. Be cheerful and strive to be happy. And with that, I will try and answer any questions, and I thank you very much for listening.